we have young boys who are taught very early that they're entitled to young girls' space in their bodies. And then those boys grow up into men, and there is an entitlement. It's treat dating as a game, check off as many girls as you can, because that says something about my masculinity. That's what masculinity is, right, in the cultural script we have. And when we are facilitating that kind of thinking in young boys, we are just creating men who are, A, not well, because we're seeing the impacts of these kind of masculinity scripts. It's not good for men. And then also men that are potentially harming the people around them with that kind of entitlement and that kind of sexism.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week has changed the world, or at least England and Wales, because Gina Martin was the driving force behind the Voyeurism Act, which made upskirting, the taking of pictures up a skirt, a specific criminal offence. And it happened after an incident that happened to her in 2017. That's what she's best known for, but now she is an activist and a writer, and she has a new book out, which is a series of essays, really, with the help of some of her friends and colleagues, called No Offence But, How to Have Difficult Conversations for Meaningful Change. Welcome. And it's kind of funny because it's a book that feels written in exasperation at talking to idiots.
Can I put that on the book with your name underneath it, please? Yeah, I mean, look, it's like come from a need, right? Like, I started this project because every event I went to, people would come up to me and go, how do you respond to this thing without losing it? Like, I can't articulate myself. I'm just so frustrated. And so it's like, well, can I make something where you're forced to sit down with it slowly and like think about where these things come from and how they impact culture and how they impact each other when we have these conversations. So I guess, yeah, it has sort of come from exasperation.
And are you comfortable to say you are an activist?
Yeah.
That is what you are?
Yeah, I didn't, for about 6 months I tried to stop calling myself that, but I don't think it's possible because I think it helps people understand what I do. Yeah.
And you never set out to be one, did you?
No.
It just happened to you.
Yeah. I think a lot of people come to this work from personal experience, right? And then people call them an activist and they go, yeah, okay, I'm active. So I think if that helps you understand my work, I'm really happy to say that.
But what's clear, I think, from the bits of writing that I've picked up at least, is that you've learned an awful lot about being an activist and about changing the world and what you need to do since your own experience around upskirting. Because in a way, you can look at that change in the law and say, well, that was quite a sort of, in a way, it was sort of a simple way to change the world, in that something happened to you, you started a campaign, you got lots of support. In a way, it was a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Because, who would defend upskirting or the right to upskirt? And so the government picked it up, backed it, changed the law, and that's it. Mm-hmm. How long did it take for you to realise that changing the law didn't change behaviour?
I used to get asked this in events all the time before I changed law. So between 2017 and 2019, I'd be doing events with like victims and survivors or the public or parents. And people always used to say, like, does changing a law change people's minds? And I would like very happily and honestly in those situations say, like, no, like a cultural conversation does. And like we have to create cultural momentum to then create political momentum. And that's what I did in that campaign. So I think I always knew that on a level. But I think at 25, 26, as someone who had just had a police case for a year and a half dropped by the CPS 3 months before I was upskirted, and then had done everything asked of me in the moment when I was upskirted, got the phone, got the picture, got one of the guys to the police, done it immediately. All the things were asked. We asked victims and survivors to do. Why didn't you do A, B, C, D, E, F, G? Did everything. And then put the picture on Facebook because the police didn't help me, and then Facebook took it down and said that it was harassment towards the guys to put the picture up. So all of these safety nets that are meant to catch me or meant to be there suddenly feel like they aren't. And so, as you say, it then becomes like a simple logical step to be like, oh, I'll do it then. But during that process, there was always that thing in my head of like, I can change a process and I can go into an institution and make this change. Actually, a lot of times I didn't think I'd be able to finish it, but if I did, that would have an impact because it would give victims and survivors choices and things to use.
Tools that you didn't have when you were a victim of upskirting.
Exactly that. Yeah, that's what I was aiming to do. But would that change minds? And no, not really. Like, it raises awareness, but our hearts and minds change by that. I don't think so. So I think I always knew that. And that's why after that campaign, my work shifted, essentially.
And that's why you had to become an activist,
Yeah.
despite having, on the face of it, achieved your goal of changing the law.
Yes, and that's where I think a lot of people thought, and I maybe originally thought the work would end, and actually that's where the work began.
I mean, I'm wary about asking you about what happened because if you ask somebody about being a victim of crime, you're asking them to relive it. But I mean, it's also quite important, I think, because it reveals sort of some of the conversations in the book about excuses that are made for bad behaviour.
Yeah.
So when you look back on it, because not everyone will be familiar with what happened, but basically you were at British Summertime going to watch The Killers,
Yeah.
and a group of lads started hassling you. One of them took a photograph that you then saw,
Yeah.
and I mean, rather bravely or perhaps madly, he sort of grabbed the phone and ran.
Yeah, I grabbed the phone off him. He had his back to me and he was looking at the picture and everyone was sort of laughing. So I was able to grab it without him seeing, and then we got into a scuffle. And I kind of did in that moment what I wish I'd done many times before, where I'd lay in bed and be like, I wish I'd done this. Like, why didn't you do this? And in that moment, somehow I felt like the context was right that I could. And a couple of the crowd helped me get away, and I ran to the police with the phone, with him chasing me, and gave them the phone. And essentially, they kind of said, yeah, we've looked at the picture. It shows more than you want it to show. We had to check it was you. It's not nice. The phrase that was said to me when that happened was, if you'd chosen not to wear knickers, it would be a graphic image, but you didn't, so you won't hear much from us. Which was just a wild thing to hear, because I've spent my entire life being told to wear more clothes to avoid assault.
Because at that point, taking a graphic image would have broken the law.
Well, the reality is that the police who dealt with my incident actually weren't equipped with the information. So that is actually technically not true. They could have prosecuted with a common law outraging public decency. That's a very 100-year-old common law that has to satisfy things like 3 or more people see it. But we could have used that. But I think with the situation, it felt so ambiguous in their heads because it didn't exist as a specific offence, that they were kind of grasping for things they could use. And in that came out the graphic image idea. And then they kind of said, you know, do you want to make a statement? I'd just been in a fight with essentially I slapped this guy and he was shaking me. You know, 6'4", I was terrified. So I was kind of not in the space to make a statement. So I said, not right now. And they left. And then I got a call 2 days later, and the person on the phone couldn't have been less bothered and just was like, the case is closed, like, we're not going to follow up. And I was like, just lost it. I'd spent my whole life dealing with this stuff and was just like, hang on a second, what if I'd been like a 13-year-old kid? What do you have to do for this to be taken seriously? And from that, it was like, I'm just going to try and do something because I'd rather be in motion and scared than just sitting here scared, which I am anyway. And so that's what people know me for, I guess, is from that moment through to the campaign and through to the conclusion, which was the law change.
And so how did you go about thinking, right, I want to do something, what am I going to do?
I Googled how do you change the law and nothing came up. And then I was like, I'm going to have to figure this out on my own. And I'd been working in advertising for 6 years as a copywriter, art director. So my job was to formulate creative concepts for billboard campaigns and social media campaigns.
To persuade people? To
persuade people to care about whiskey they never want to buy, right? So I remember being like, okay, well, could I apply those skills instead of selling you whiskey? Could I sell you the idea that this matters? That this question, why is this not a specific offence, matters? And there was about 2 months where I was just sort of doing social media strategy with, this happened to me, why is it not being taken seriously? Has this happened to anyone else? And just opened floodgates of just thousands of people contacting me. And it was unending. It was emails from teachers whose male students had worked together to do that to them, to upskirt them. It was kids. It was older ladies who were saying, I don't understand why they would do that to me because I'm no longer young, as if it's a compliment. It was just really wild. And then from that 2 months where I realised there was a real need and this was happening so much, then I was like, I have to get really serious. Raising awareness, I think it's past the point of that. I think I have to try and do something that's going to change this reality that I'd experienced. So I took the numbers of that campaign and went to law firms and said, the public care about this, will you represent this? I don't have any money. And that became the political campaign.
And I'm guessing almost immediately you will have been having the kinds of conversations you now have written about.
Yes.
Which was people sort of explaining away the behaviour.
Yeah, minimising it.
Boys will be boys.
Exactly.
Which is the one you started with in the book.
Yeah, Boys Will Be Boys starts pretty early. And it follows boys through their life as they turn into men. And I think it's that real low expectation of behaviour that we have around boys, the boisterous nature of them, that it's sort of a natural conclusion of their gender, that it's sort of biological to some degree. And I was hearing that all the time. I was also hearing, if you don't want attention, why don't you cover up, which I also wrote. I was also hearing not all men all the time, as if when we discuss an experience, bringing in a group of people who don't perpetrate that experience has any relevance to the thing we're discussing. And so I've just spent 7 years around these phrases, and I think that's why in my chapters in this book, I've focused on those, because I know so many people who have come up to me and been like, please help me. It frazzles me every time I hear it, because there is an answer, but I can't unpick why it frustrates me so much. So I was like, let me try and unpick it. I'll tell you why it frustrates me so much.
So I mean, obviously, without reciting the whole chapter, but start with boys will be boys. If somebody now says that to you in conversation,
yeah,
what is your first response?
My emotional response is that that's the easiest thing to say, to not have to deal with behaviour, ultimately. That we explain away kind of boisterous behaviour by boys because it's much easier to attribute it to their gender and make it a biological question than to deal with why we treat boys differently to how we treat little girls. Why, when a little girl is playing and hurts herself, we feel like we're wrapped in cotton wool, but when a boy does it, we go, they'll be fine. We sort of the manifestation of boys.
Because perhaps one of the problems with that crowd of boys at that pop concert was that they didn't really think what they were doing was particularly bad.
Yeah, I mean, we have young boys who are taught very early that they're entitled to young girls' space and their bodies. And then those boys grow up into men, and there is an entitlement. It's treat dating as a game, check off as many girls as you can, because that says something about my masculinity. That's what masculinity is, right, in the cultural script we have, is that it is about getting girls, being successful, having money, being emotionless, or anger being an appropriate emotion, but the others not being appropriate or accepted. And when we are facilitating that kind of thinking in young boys, we are just creating men who are, A, not well, because we're seeing the impacts of these kind of masculinity scripts. It's not good for men. And then also men that are potentially harming the people around them with that kind of entitlement and that kind of sexism.
How did you go from then a social media campaign to politics as the answer?
Practically, I went from running a social media campaign, packaging the numbers to sell it to traditional media, to say there's viewers for this, you should cover it, and then packaging up essentially the impressions and the impact of that traditional media campaign to a law firm. And then, because the connection between law and politics is so short, like so many politicians used to be lawyers, managing to get meetings and asking the question, not why is this not a sexual offence, but why haven't you adopted the same position that Scotland adopted 10 years ago? And offering up a political solution in Parliament, not saying there's a problem, you need to solve it because they've got a lot on. It was like we did the work up front so we could go in and be like, there's this question, the public are really angry about it. I was getting the public very angry about it and then being like, look, they're very angry. And going in and saying, with my lawyer, we have a political solution, it's workable, Scotland have done it. All you have to do is agree in principle and then we can follow this through as a bill.
And so how did you sort of game it out in terms of, well, who should we approach? Should we go to the government? Should we go to the opposition? Should we go to a private member?
At first, the question was just do we get our foot in the door? So it's just like, how do we hold meetings with people? They're not going to take those initial meetings potentially very seriously, because I'm sure they have a lot of people coming to their office and saying this should happen. So we just needed to get in and have a couple of those meetings first. But then once we had access, then that came a really serious conversation about how do we make this campaign not a political football? Like, how do we position it so that politicians of all parties are able to agree with it in principle and it doesn't become a slinging match? And the way we did that was essentially to sort of play the same game that politicians play, which is like we would meet with someone, but they wouldn't know we were meeting with them. And then we'd meet with someone else. And we sort of slowly but secretly kind of built an army of people who agreed in principle. And by the time we did that, we were positioning the media campaign as, I guess, constructing a narrative about how great it was that they're all unifying on this issue, so that they then were like, oh, great, this is good PR, we should unify on this issue. So I guess it's politics in the media versus politics in Parliament. And also just really important that everyone we worked with on that particular campaign knew our priority list, right? So every politician or minister we were working with knew that our priority was our campaign, the law change, and then they came next. And who came next was whoever had the ability to actually make this change. And at that time, that was a Conservative government. So we had to have those relationships with ministers to make sure that we could pass it, and they didn't feel like we were giving it to whoever wanted to get great PR off it,
And
essentially.
was it all positive? Or did you have people...
No, it was not.
You know, was anybody saying the kinds of things that you're writing about in the book in terms of, well, you know...
Yes.
Should you have worn trousers or whatever it might have been, you know?
Maybe not to those words, but yes, those attitudes did definitely exist in Parliament, and I did experience those, and that was difficult. There was a lot of, you know, me going up to the reception and saying I have a meeting and them ignoring me and saying, excuse me, is this your meeting, to Ryan, my lawyer, who was 7 feet away from me. Like, there was a lot of undermining and condescending nature that I experienced because I was just this young girl being like, I want to change the law. I think over time I was able to show them that I was actually really pragmatic and I was actually pretty smart on this and I knew what the solution was and I understood it. But there was a lot of sort of interactions that I look back and feel like they were negative, and I think that's because Parliament is a very old establishment with some people who have quite regressive views. It's not like they're going to gender workshops every week. It's not like, you know, these issues are front and centre for, you know, lots of cis men. These issues aren't front and centre for. And so I was experiencing that. I was coming up against it. I wasn't surprised by that. And when that came up, our job was to convince them and try to get them to agree in principle. They didn't even have to care, but they just had to agree so we could move forward.
So you got to the point where this was a private member's bill.
Yeah.
It goes to Parliament, and then famously, Christopher Chos, the Conservative MP, objects.
Yeah.
And that kills the bill.
Yeah, essentially.
What was your reaction?
Well, I knew about 2 days before that was a possibility. Me and Ryan were really good at knowing the avenues and outcomes that could happen and having plans for if they did. If we didn't do that, then we'd just be following politicians. They would be defining our campaign for us. So we knew that was a possibility. We had support from Lib Dems, Labour, Greens, and Conservatives at that point, and ministers. And we found out, but we'd made sure to secure government support before that happened, so that if it happened, we could go to Lucy Fraser and say, how are we going to move forward from this? This is on you.
Lucy Fraser being the minister?
Yeah, at the time. So when I found out, we actually decided to do a lot of victory media because we just secured government backing. So they said, we will give this time, we will get this through. And for us, that was as good as any agreement in principle that this was going to happen. So I did I don't know how many. I was almost half dead. 2 days maybe of interviews. You would have seen the video of me holding the bill up and smiling. And that was because we'd got government backing, but it was also because if I could tell the public that this was going to happen when Christopher Chos objected, they would go berserk. And we needed them to go to berserk so we could then use that to get us through the next stage, to get the bill to pass. I was actually on Parliament Square about to do an interview, and I got a text from Ryan, my lawyer, saying, get off the TV and come now to Parliament. And I actually had to pull the earpiece out and run away, and it was 5 seconds from the interview. And I got to Parliament, and he said, he's going to object now. And I went into a bathroom, and I almost started crying, and I stopped myself, and I put on Beyonce for 30 seconds in my headphones and looked in the mirror and did something that I don't do, which is talk to myself and be like, you'll get through this, it's going to be okay, we can do this, we're right, we can do this. And then I walked through, sat in the gallery, and he objected. And I came out into the lobby, and he was there, and Ryan said, go and speak to him. So I went over to him, and I asked him why he objected. And he said, which one? And I said, the Voyeurism Act. And I said, it's the upskirting bill. And he said, I don't know what upskirting is. I said, well, I'm really happy to talk to you about that. Let's make a meeting and I'll tell you what that is. And he said, I haven't read it. And in that moment, I was like, cool. That's our political process that 649 MPs can agree in principle for something, and then this one doesn't, and it can kill our bill. And he hasn't even read the bill. And I put a statement...
Because he has a procedural objection to the way private members' bills go forward.
Even though he's tabled so many of his own. And I left the lobby. I wrote a statement immediately so that we had control of the narrative. And I know, it all went off. His office got vandalised. He got doorstepped. There was knickers on his door. People were writing songs about it. It was such a big story. How
did you feel about that?
Great. I'm sorry.
He deserved it.
My priority is not Christopher Chos, backbench MP, who's frustrated that a girl's come in and got a bill through. My priority is victims and survivors are dealing with this every day. I don't care. And he came out 3 days later and said, this has been a really hard week for me, actually. It's been the worst week of my life. And I was like, the worst week of my life is when I've been sexually assaulted. I don't care. You're an MP. You're a politician. Take these things on the chin. That was your decision you made. He also kept calling me Gina Miller. And he also said that I agreed with him. So, I don't care. So that was an emotional moment, but I was confident that the things we'd put in place meant that we could pull it back. And we went in the next morning with Lucy Fraser and said, how are we going to approach this? And we said, we need to table a government bill. So this goes above MP's head, so this becomes law. And she said, I'm happy to do that. Let's do that. And we're a Hub House who had the private members bill.
Who was a Lib Dem.
Who was a Lib Dem MP at the time and had tabled the private members bill. She didn't want to let go of it, so we had basically two at the same time. But the government bill was what then eventually became law after a year of work, yeah.
I mean, you talk about the media, and you've written very interestingly about your experience on Good Morning Britain.
Yes.
Well, just talk us through that, because what you seem to have sort of taken away from sort of doing
this
media
is very brave to talk about this.
is the sort of the game of doing the media and the performance elements of going out and doing these sorts of discussions.
Yeah, I think obviously
on some programs.
On some programs, very comfortable here though. I have to say, I like this one. Yeah, I think obviously I was quite naive at the beginning. I thought I was just going to have to go there and tell my story. It was going to be received in good faith, and it wouldn't be a debate. Because my experiences aren't a debate. That's how I felt. And one of my first experiences was Good Morning Britain. When I was in the green room, I was introduced to someone who was going to be on the panel with me. And everything was very kind and nice and warm. And she actually said, oh, well done, your work's great, incredible work. And I was like, wow, this is going to be really good. Like, this is going to be really nice, and this is going to really help the campaign. And then we were sat down and mic'd, and then the camera started rolling. And what ensued was this just debate about essentially whose fault it is that I was upskirted. And I was just sort of sitting there silently going like, this is just not about actually what happened to me. It's not even about the campaign. It's just about creating a piece of media that gets people at home to sort of argue about it and go, wow, isn't that crazy? And then carry on with the rest of the day. This doesn't help me.
But you then have to decide, as a campaigner who wants something, how much you're going to engage with
Exactly,
this,
yeah.
and whether you're going to do more of it.
Exactly, because then the question is like, what impact did that appearance have on the campaign? And only the only impacts I want as a campaigner are something I can leverage or use, because my whole point is I have an objective. And I couldn't leverage or use that because essentially I'd just gone on a TV show and someone had been victim blaming me, and I was like, cool. Then you come off the show, you get 5,000 messages victim blaming you on your social media. So then the decision became I'm only doing media that isn't sensationalist, that isn't a bit of entertainment, that isn't what I would call a bit of a farce, but is useful for the movement, useful for the campaign, and useful for the objective.
Now, you have said in your TED Talk that social media was hugely powerful.
Yeah.
So just sort of explain, how you have ended up viewing the relative power of different media, if you want to change people's minds.
Yeah, social media was for my campaign and continues to be for campaigners phenomenal for creating organizer networks in a way that we've just never been able to do that before. In the Jewish meat boycotts in America, housewives were calling interstate and flyering and trying to do meetups, and it would take weeks at a time. We can do that now within days, and we can create in Google Docs and in interactive ways. We can create campaigns essentially together with people who care about the same things that we maybe would have never come across otherwise. So I was able to put a sort of fire hose behind the campaign in that I was able to, with my petition, put money behind the petition to target feminist groups, gender equality groups, parents and teachers who cared about this stuff. They would be served the petition, they would sign it, I could then use those signatures, I could organise with victims and survivor groups, I could write case studies because I was able to contact people I'd never come into contact with. So that was phenomenal for that kind of core activation of getting the right people who care about the issue fired up. You've
also talked about the other, apart from the conversation, difficult conversations, you also come in for a huge amount of abuse once you take on one of these causes.
Yeah.
And none of us are equipped for that.
Nope.
So what happened? How were you equipped for it? How do you look back on it now?
I look back on it like, wow, what a bad job you did of taking care of yourself. How desperate were you to appear like you were super strong and like the perfect victim and absolutely dealing with it fine?
Because you have to be strong when you go on.
I have to convince people to believe in me. People have to follow the campaign because I'm the face of it for some reason, which is uncomfortable. And they have to believe in me because I am the campaign. So I have to be strong.
But you're getting the most horrific stuff.
But I'm struggling privately massively for years. I think I went through all of the iterations that you would when you're getting abuse in your emails, in your Instagram DMs. People are coming up to you and saying stuff. I got followed to the tube on the way to my meeting with Lucy Fraser by a guy who knew about my campaign and was screaming at me. I think I started by being like, I can handle this. Other people may not have been able to, but I know I can handle this because I'm special and unique. Then I made jokes about it to try and minimize it. Then I tried to take time away from my phone, which never worked because my phone was my work. Then I started telling people around me that it was getting too much and I was struggling to deal with it. And then essentially my friends and family had to pull out the honesty in me, which was like, I'm not dealing with it very well. And I had to put things in place. So there was a period of time where I actually gave a friend of mine my phone and I would ask for it when I needed work and I would give it back. I deleted apps for days at a time. But more holistically, I, after the campaign, started going to therapy, which I should have done at the beginning of the campaign, created a really watertight support system of people around me that I could just talk to and cry about it for hours, because no one understands what you're going through when you're receiving that level of abuse, and it never leaves you because it's in your pocket. You can't escape it.
So can you explain the impact on you? Because a lot of people go, but it's just idiots saying stupid things, so why don't you just shrug it off?
I know. Your brain doesn't know the difference. Your brain is either feels safe or it doesn't feel safe. And when there's thousands of messages, emails, people that say stuff to you in real life, and that spectrum looks like anything from a woman emailing you saying, your work is ridiculous. We were fighting for fundamentals when we were fighting for the vote, and now girls like you are just sad that when a man puts his hand on your knee, to men who are literally sending you 300 words describing how they would kill you. Like, your brain doesn't know that you're safe, and so that impacts like everything. Like I installed a home alarm system. You know, I used to not do stuff. Sometimes I wouldn't go out because I was like, people are going to recognize me, and people do recognize me a lot because of the work, and I'm so thankful for that. Often people have used the law, they'll pass me a note, they'll hug me and say thank you, and I love those interactions. But that feeling of like voyeurism, ironically, of like people watching you, making decisions about how they view you, and then absolutely so angry at you when you've never met them. I used to open my phone and men would be sending me voice notes where they would be screaming at me. I've never met them in my life. That impact is like a nervous system impact. So I reckon for a period of 2 years, my nervous system was just here all the time. And I used to jump. Like people would come up and say, oh my God, I love your work. And I would like jump because I was scared. I was scared for a long time. And now I think I'm in a much healthier position where I have really good boundaries with my phone, and I use all the tools at my disposal to keep myself safe, and I don't share as much online, and I talk to everyone around me, the people that love me, about how I'm feeling. But like that impact I don't think leaves you. I think when you live under gender inequality and when you live in a culture that rape culture is part of all the time, and you have experienced assault and you have been through harm like that, when you're reminded of that every day by your phone, it can make you quite unwell. And I'm really proud of myself that I was able to come through it and look after myself after the fact, because I didn't during the campaign, not very well.
And it's still clearly very raw, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to upset you, but...
No, it's okay, this is part of the work.
So what would your advice be now to people who are, or to yourself back then?
Yeah.
As to how to approach that or deal with it?
I don't know that I would have listened to myself.
Well,
I don't think, I think people can tell you what, we can say you need to be off your phone more, you need to put space between you and these people. And you go, yeah, I know, but I have to check my messages because my emails are in there, but I think I would have said, have a place every week that you can go and put all this stuff. And I didn't have that, I didn't have therapy. Not everyone can pay for therapy. I couldn't then, it wasn't accessible to me. So I would say, where are you putting it? Are you writing about it? Because whatever you're dealing with, you're carrying. So are you putting it somewhere? Are you putting it with other people? Are you allowing people to help you? Are you leaning on the people around you? Or are you too proud to because you want to appear really, really strong and like, you actually don't have to because you shouldn't have to go through this? Is
it definitely worth it?
Yes, it is worth it. It is worth it. But
You paused then a bit.
Yeah, I did. It's worth it because I care much more about the people I'm helping than I care about the people who hate me, But like, it's worth it, but it's only worth it if I move through it differently than I did from now on.
So why have you invited a load of other people to write essays in this book?
Because I wanted to write my chapters about gender equality issues and sexual violence, but there are so many issues that intersect so deeply with it, I just didn't feel like I could release a book that didn't have those issues involved. We have Charlie Craig's writing on trans rights there, and trans youth. That's gender inequality.
What do you make of her argument then, taking on the statement, children shouldn't be allowed to transition because what if they change their minds?
The last 10 years has seen like a remarkable pushback against trans people existing and the decisions they make about their own bodies and their own lives, how they self-actualize. And Charlie Craig's is someone who is beautifully honest and straightforward about their experience as a trans woman, but also how we should be approaching these big questions. And that phrase was focused on and put in the book because there is an enormous amount of debate about trans youth, and it's all coming from cis people who have never experienced what it feels like to be trans. And there is an enormous amount of debate that is based on definitions of words we hear in that debate that we don't actually understand the answer to. For instance, transition. You say the word transition, and almost everyone thinks you mean surgery. We don't talk about the fact that most trans youth just want to socially transition. They want to wear clothes that affirm their gender. They want to grow their hair out. They want to go by a different name. And I think that chapter makes it quite clear that the point at which we're having the conversation now is pretty inaccurate to what the reality is. And so it was really important for it to be in this book because I'm a gender equality activist. And I think when people hear that, they think it means women and men, and it means people of all genders. And so I had to have this in the book because it's such a pressing issue and because I just too often am reading the amount of articles they put out between I think it was 2 years, and there was over 100 articles about trans people that were hostile in nature. And the great majority of them, upwards of 90%, were not written by trans people. So I want trans voices in my books to talk about the issues we're talking about because they understand them.
So what do you say to gender equality activists or campaigners who disagree with you on
trans rights? I say
yeah.
Trans people have a gender and trans people exist, and gender equality doesn't get to a solution if it doesn't create solutions for everyone. We can't pick and choose who we give our humanity to in gender equality work.
Because there seems to be sort of a political consensus developing right now in Britain.
Big time.
Around saying, going back basically to saying there's gender and sex and they're different,
Yeah.
and we've got to accept that, and this is just a common sense solution.
Yeah.
Are they wrong?
I think that debate isn't particularly in good faith. I don't see that debate being had by the people who the solutions are going to impact the most. I also don't think we as a society have a grasp on gender and sex. I don't think we understand gender identity. I don't think we were ever taught to have conversations about it. The amount of conversations I have with people where the fundamental discussion has to be had that gender identity is socially constructed. That if I grew up in a room where I'd never seen other people, I wouldn't know how to dress as a woman. I wouldn't know how to move through the world as a woman. So much of the way that we build ourselves are based on cultural scripts. And we know this because gender is completely different depending on the time period, the country we're talking about. It shifts and expands all the time. You know, in India right now, we have Khiras who are millions of people who have been trans for, decades and centuries, an age-old community of people. And we can learn a lot from looking around at other countries at different eras and listening to trans people about what they need to live a life of dignity and a life of choice and a life of freedom. But I don't think the conversation we're having in Britain right now is including them at all. And I actually think it's incredibly harmful to them.
As an activist, one of your big challenges is to get away from talking to people who agree with you.
Yeah.
And talk to people who don't really want to have a conversation about
Which
this.
is everyone, yeah.
And you've got a chapter called "I Don't Do Politics."
Yes.
Which I think is sort of a big conversation as well at the moment.
Yeah.
With a lot of people just don't want to talk about this stuff. They find it exhausting. It's like, I don't want to get into that woke debate and all that kind of stuff. Leave me alone. Can we talk about something else? Should you just sort of respect that when people don't want to get involved?
Yes, but I would gently ask why. I always will question whether I don't want to get into that debate is because I'm fearful I'll say the wrong thing or because I don't care. And those are two very different mindsets. And I Don't Do Politics, the chapter was written because I, for a long time, was like, I don't do politics. I talk about that. I pick up the metro and I just read the Rush Hour Crush when I was 19. I didn't want to read anything about what was going on in British politics and society because I was fearful of it. I didn't really understand it. I felt ill-equipped to have got a conversation about it or analyse it. And it was only really when I was able to be like, oh, okay, it doesn't have to just be about what's happening in Westminster and what Rishi Sunak's guidance is and what funding has been given to where. It can also, what policy. It can also be about small p politics. Like, we're all doing politics all the time. Everything we do is politics. So you do politics. You do it all the time. So what matters to you? Let's have a conversation about that. Are you frustrated that the thing that you love doing the most every week, which is going to the pub with your mates, when you're working all week, you're absolutely knackered, you want to go to the pub and have a drink with your mates, and you're frustrated because you can't really afford a pint anymore because costs have gone up so much? That's politics. So when people shy away from these conversations, I will always gently probe and ask why, because I think the more conversations we're having, the better. But there's a way to do that. There's a way to do that that doesn't shut people down. There's a way to do that to allow them to open up. And I think that's the difference.
You've tackled a lot of topics in this book with other people. To what extent are you a practicing ally on other issues? You know, are these just other issues that you get, yes, I've got to support them too, because I'm a gender equality activist, and all of these things are intersectional? Or do you actually, are there any ways you live your life where you actually do things that hit those things?
And that's why, there is. I'm have this like mindset about my work that is, I came to it not because it was a job, but because it was just like a way that I see the world and like a lens through which decisions I make, the way I act. I don't think I can call myself a gender equality activist unless it's impacting my life. It changes the way I move through the world. And I used to play drums when I was younger, and you practice more than you perform. And so I tried to apply that to this, which is that, and I also just really care about people. Like, I just really believe in people. And it's hard sometimes to do that because everything's such a mess, but like, I create this work because I live like this. Like, I'm in therapy every week, trying to be better at how I view people and trying to be better at unlearning a lot of the stuff I've been taught about people. I don't think I could be an activist if the work didn't reflect how I live my life. And that looks a million different ways. It looks like big things, like the things you see all the time, like consistently donating to things, moving resources around. It also looks like changing language. It also looks like asking myself really hard questions and being really honest when I've messed up. And I just want to be like that. I really want to grow as a person through this work. And I'm proud that I continue to, and it isn't always easy, but that's the part of the process. And I have to demonstrate that because I don't want to demonstrate perfection. I want us to have people who are messing up and saying, I messed up, or I didn't understand this and now I do, or I've moved away from this, because that's human. That's what being a person is.
How do your family react to all of this? I mean, are you the sort of, like, do people joke about it? Are you like, don't say that in front of Gina, or...
No, I'm lucky. I'm really lucky. I think at the beginning there was a shift because I learned so much in such a short amount of time, relatively 5 years. The way I talk has changed, the kind of things. I'm able to articulate the instincts I had at 25. Now I actually can articulate it. I have the language, I have the skills. My family have tried to grow with me, which is really lovely. And they ask me questions and we have hard conversations. But I've been very clear about surrounding myself with people who will accept the way I see the world and the way I think. And
because the way you think and see the world has changed quite a lot by the sound of it since this happened to you. You've kind of been opened to a whole new way of thinking.
I think I had a foundation that allowed that to happen easily. Like, I was always very compassionate. I was always trying to do things to help people. I was always like raising funds, and like I was part of a collective in advertising that did free work for charities. Like, I've always been that kind of person, but my ability to understand frameworks and systems and change my behaviour based on them and be much more active in that regard has really, really developed. And my family are super supportive of it, and I'm really lucky because I would struggle if they weren't.
And so what about you personally then? I mean, is this the rest of your life, do you think?
Yeah.
You're a lifelong activist.
No, I'm going to
now.
go back to selling whiskey and advertising. Yeah. The doors are open. When the floodgates open with this, you can't go back. There's nothing else that I care about more than people and trying to contribute to a better society, and a society in which everyone is able to make decisions about themselves, their bodies, is able to actualise in the way they need to. I'm facilitating now. I'm training in facilitation. So I'll be in schools having conversations with young boys about masculinity, about how they feel about themselves, about what being a boy means, about power. I'll be having conversations with young girls about what it means to be a girl in the world.
I mean, and when you do that, do you live in fear of the Daily Mail two-page, you'll never believe what they're saying to our children article?
I live in frustration. I don't live in fear because they don't do it. They don't know what it is. They don't have the basics to understand what happens in those rooms, and it's magic. Because the reality is, with facilitation, we're literally not allowed to tell kids what to think. Facilitation is only asking questions. And what you do is you give them space to arrive at their own conclusions. And often in those spaces, those conclusions can be what the internet would say is really problematic. They say really messed up stuff. And it's good. Because if they don't say the messed up stuff, we can't get to something about it. If we can't accept where they are, kids make mistakes, kids push boundaries, kids are hearing messages. That's okay. But we'll be there to help you grow and come to a conclusion that's healthier for you and everyone around you.
If you could change the world in any way then, how would you change it?
I would give every single person space to explore their relationship to their gender from the get-go, their relationship to their social location from the get-go, and I would equip them with critical thinking skills to make decisions that are healthier for them and everyone around them. We wouldn't only be in institutions where we're taught information, to remember it, to have the right answers, to get the exam right. We'd also be in spaces where we were able to explore big questions about ourselves, about society, about where we fit into that, about the power we have, about the privilege we have, about the struggles we've endured, about how we reacted to those.
Why does that make the world a better place?
Because it allows people to understand who they are, and it allows people to very, very simply see people's humanity past their identity and past these kind of division lines that have been created to separate us. And that's transformational work. And so those kinds of spaces, if we had those, I think we'd be looking at a very different society.
Gina Martin, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.